We are entering the final stage of a 100-year cycle. What happened in total secrecy on Jekyll Island in 1913 wasn't just a meeting. It was the architectural blueprint for the 2026 economic reset. The banks didn't just fail. They planned the transition. And if you're holding the wrong assets when the ledger flips, you aren't just losing your savings. You're losing your sovereignty. To understand the coming collapse, we have to look at how the trap was set at the very beginning. The Federal Reserve, the most powerful financial institution on Earth, wasn't born in Congress. It wasn't debated in the halls of democracy. It was conceived in absolute secrecy. On a private island off the coast of Georgia, November 1910, 7 men. No last names. A single private rail car departing Hoboken Station under the cover of darkness. Their mission? To draft the blueprint for a central bank that would control the currency of the most powerful nation in history. And they succeeded. But here's the part they don't teach you in economics class. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 wasn't a response to financial instability. It was the cause of it. A structural coup disguised as reform. And by the time the American people realized what had been signed into law, the architecture of their financial sovereignty had already been sold. To understand how a private banking cartel hijacked the US money supply and why your dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power since that night on Jekyll Island, we have to go back. Back to the secret meeting. Back to the men who rewrote the rules of reality. And back to the documents they hoped you'd never read. November 22nd, 1910. The wealthiest men in America didn't arrive on Jekyll Island by accident. They arrived by design. Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., sent the invitations. But these weren't social calls. This was a covert financial summit. The guest list read like a directory of American oligarchy. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in America. Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Paul Warburg, a German-born banking strategist with deep ties to the Rothschild Empire. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust, and Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York. They traveled under assumed names. First names only. No servants. No reporters. Total operational silence. The reason? If the American public discovered that the architects of the nation's new banking system were bankers, the plan would collapse before it ever reached Congress. So they disappeared. For 9 days, they locked themselves inside the Jekyll Island Club and drafted the Federal Reserve Act in complete secrecy. These men weren't evil. They were calculated. They didn't see themselves as conspirators, they saw themselves as sovereign architects. Men who understood that the global economy wasn't a free market. It was a blueprint to be managed. And the American people? They were variables in an equation. The goal was simple: centralize control of the money supply, eliminate competition from regional banks, and ensure that financial power would never again be decentralized. They called it stabilization. History would call it something else. But here's the architecture of the theft. The Federal Reserve was undesigned to serve the public. It was designed to serve its creators. A private corporation with the power to print money, set interest rates, and bail out failing banks. With zero accountability to voters. And the most brilliant part? They made it sound like a government institution. Federal Reserve. The branding was flawless. The deception, indifferently powerful. December 23rd, 1913. 2 days before Christmas. Most of Congress had already left for the holidays. The halls were empty. The American public was distracted. And in that silence, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. 72 hours of debate. No public hearings. No referendum. The most consequential financial legislation in American history. Passed in the dead of night while the nation slept. But what exactly did they create? Here's the layman's bridge. Imagine a casino where the house doesn't just set the odds, it prints the chips. And every time you sit down to play, the value of your chips decreases. But the house's chips stay the same. That's the Federal Reserve. A private banking cartel with the legal authority to create money out of nothing, loan it to the government at interest, and then collect that interest from taxpayers. You work, they print. You pay taxes. They profit. The mechanism is deceptively simple. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply. When they print more money, each dollar you hold loses value. That's inflation. But they don't call it theft. They call it monetary policy. They don't say they're devaluing your savings, they say they're managing liquidity. The language is clinical. The result is brutal. Every dollar printed is a tax on every dollar saved. A hidden transfer of wealth from the working class to the banking class. From Main Street to Wall Street. And the trap was structural. Before 1913, the US dollar was backed by gold. If you wanted to print money, you needed gold in the vault. That was the break. That was the limit. But the Federal Reserve removed the brake. They introduced elastic currency, a system where money could expand and contract based on the needs of the economy. Translation? They could print as much as they wanted whenever they wanted, with no physical constraint. But the real turning point, the moment the trap fully sprung, didn't come in 1913. It came in 1971, August 15th. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The gold standard was over. This wasn't a policy change. This was a structural coup. Overnight, the dollar became a pure fiat currency backed by nothing but the promise of a government drowning in debt. And the Federal Reserve? They could now print infinity. Think about it. In 1913, the average American home cost $3,500. Today, over $400,000. A loaf of bread, 5 cents. Today, $3. Your grandfather's dollar could buy a week's worth of groceries. Yours can barely buy a gallon of milk. That's not coincidence, that's architecture. The Federal Reserve didn't just manage the economy, they engineered the largest wealth transfer in human history. And they did it with a printing press. Fast forward to today. The architecture built on Jekyll Island isn't theoretical anymore, it's collapsing in real time. And the cracks are everywhere. In 2023, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet exceeded $8.7 trillion. To put that in perspective, in the year 2000, it was $600 billion. They've printed more money in the last 15 years than in the entire century before it. The result? The pulse of a dying system. Let's talk hard numbers. The median home price in the United States has increased by over 400% since 1980, while real wages have barely moved. A gallon of gas that cost 30 cents in 1970 now costs $4. A college education that once cost $400 a year now costs $40,000. But here's the mirror. Your income hasn't multiplied by 100. Your purchasing power has been systematically destroyed. This isn't inflation, it's engineered poverty. The hidden tax that steals hours from your life's work. And the Federal Reserve? They call this price stability. They say they're targeting 2% inflation per year. Sounds harmless, right? But do the math. At 2% annual inflation, your money loses half its value every 35 years. That means if you're 25 years old today, by the time you retire, your savings will buy half of what they buy now. And that's if they hit their target. In 2022, inflation spiked to 9.1%, the highest rate in over 40 years. Grocery prices surged, energy costs exploded, rent became unaffordable. The middle class got crushed. But here's where the modern mirror becomes terrifying. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. The 16th largest bank in America, gone in 48 hours. Then Signature Bank, then First Republic. The dominoes started falling. And what did the Federal Reserve do? They fired up the printing press again. Billions in emergency loans. Overnight liquidity injections. They bailed out the banks. With your money. Money that didn't exist until they created it. And every dollar they printed diluted the value of every dollar in your wallet. This is the trap in action. The Federal Reserve can't stop printing. Because if they do, the entire debt-based system collapses. The US government is $34 trillion in debt. The interest payments alone are over $1 trillion per year. Who do they owe? The Federal Reserve. And how does the government pay the interest? By borrowing more money from the Federal Reserve. It's a debt spiral with no exit. A Ponzi scheme where the only way to keep the lights on is to print more currency and hope the world keeps accepting it. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. Every fiat currency in history has eventually collapsed to its intrinsic value. 0. The average lifespan of a fiat currency, 27 years. The US dollar has been fully fiat since 1971. Do the math, we're 53 years in. And the cracks are no longer theoretical, they're structural. The question isn't if the system breaks, the question is, what happens when it does? The ledger of history is rarely written by the many. It is carved in the dark by the few who understand that control of money is control of reality. Jekyll Island wasn't an anomaly, it was the template. A blueprint for how sovereign power is transferred from nations to institutions, from voters to vaults, from the visible to the invisible. The Federal Reserve didn't just reshape America. It rewired the entire global financial architecture. And here's the cold, hard truth they don't want you to see. The Federal Reserve was never meant to be the endpoint. It was the prototype. Once the model proved successful, once they demonstrated that a private banking cartel could control a nation's currency without accountability, without oversight, without revolution, the system went global. Central banks began appearing in every developed nation. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, each one structured the same way. Each one with the same mandate: control the money supply, manage inflation, and ensure that debt flows upward. But the mechanics remain unchanged. They print, you borrow, they profit. You pay. The system is self-perpetuating because the incentives are perfectly aligned, not for you, but for them. The architect who designs the casino doesn't gamble. He collects the rake and the house always wins. Because the house writes the rules. This is why Jekyll Island matters. Not because 7 men met in secret over a century ago, but because the structure they built is still standing, still functioning, still extracting. Your inflation isn't a mistake, it's a feature. Your debt isn't accidental, it's architectural. And your belief that voting will change the system? That's the final illusion. Central banks aren't elected. They're appointed. By whom? By the very institutions they were designed to protect. In the end, we don't own the system. The system owns the silence of complexity, the silence of jargon, the silence of assumed legitimacy. They call it monetary policy. We call it survival. And as long as the machinery keeps running, as long as the grocery stores stay stocked and the lights stay on, most people will never ask the question that terrifies power most. Who gave you permission? If you want to stay ahead of the coming shift, join our community. But the story doesn't end with the Federal Reserve. Because above every central bank, above the Fed, above the ECB, above the Bank of England, there's another institution. One that operates in total silence. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks. And if you think Jekyll Island was secretive, you haven't seen anything yet. That story, the secret bank that rules every central bank, I have broken down for you right here.